Organisms and the cells that make them up are very diverse. Contrast this rigid plant cell surrounded by a cell wall and containing chloroplasts that's perfect for helping plants stand up straight and photosynthesize, with this shape-changing white blood cell from our blood that is currently chasing after some small bacterial cells and trying to engulf them and eat them. This would be typical of the Animalia branch on the Tree of Life. Different and far simpler are the cells of these small bacteria, or some of their relatives, the archaeobacteria, shown right here. And then we can't leave out these fungal cells, which also have cell walls like the plant cells, but have small structures that allow them to move, kind of like animal cells. What allows these organisms, and indeed these cells, to be so different from each other? The structure and function of a cell depends on the smaller structures that are found within them that perform specific functions, called organelles. And there are many, some of which you may have heard of, such as flagella right here, the nucleus right here, a Golgi apparatus, mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, vesicle, cell membrane. All of these are similar in that they are basically little bags of macromolecules, so those molecules that make up organisms, and the enzymes that either break down those molecules or build them up. But depending on which macromolecules and enzymes are present, the organelles can do very different things. So this video lecture is designed to help you master the different functions of these organelles. One thing to keep in mind is that organelles are pretty darn small. They're much smaller than, say, this spider, which is measured in millimeters. That's 1/1000th of a meter stick. They're even smaller than, say, red blood cells or bacterial cells, which are measured in 1/1,000,000th of a meter stick. That's 1 micrometer. They're not quite as small as molecules, such as this DNA molecule right here, which is about 1 nanometer across, or 1/1000,000th of a meter stick. They're partway in between, so between the 10 nanometer and 100 nanometer range. The largest of these organelles are the ones found on the outside of the cell. I'll call them the border guards, and there are two basic structures found around the outside of cells. The first, found only in plant, fungal, and bacterial cells, is called the cell wall, and it provides a lot of structural support for the cell. In contrast, the cell membrane, which is found around all cells as well, sometimes also called the plasma membrane, is selectively permeable. That means it controls what materials enter the cell and what go out. Cell membranes are really good at being selectively permeable. They're really good at controlling what goes in and out for two reasons. One is because they're made of a phospholipid bilayer. Bi equals 2, and you can see the two layers of phospholipids here, and here's an individual phospholipid. You will recall from the talk on macromolecules that phospholipids have a hydrophilic head that is charged and water can adhere to. But the water cannot go across the membrane because the inside is hydrophobic. This means that most large substances which can dissolve in water can't pass across because of the hydrophobic barrier. There are, however, some protein channels and protein pumps throughout the membrane, such as this one right here, that create a little tunnel that allow some materials, the materials that the cell chooses, to pass across and enter. The other border guard type organelle is the cell wall. Cell walls are only found on some organisms, such as around this plant cell. You can see the large rigid structure that gives the plant cell its shape right there. And cell walls, they don't regulate what comes in and out. They're not really for protection or anything like that, but they do provide the overall plant with structural support. So as long as you've watered your plant recently and the plant cell is filled with plenty of that water, the water will push out against the cell wall and create a very rigid structure that allows the plant to stand straight up. Not so much, though, if you forgot to water your plant recently. What specific molecule makes the cell wall so strong? Well, if you zoomed in on the leaf and you looked at the cells and then you zoomed in on the cell wall, which is around the outside of the cells, you would find these long microfibrils, and if you broke those apart, you'd find long strands of, this is a polysaccharide called cellulose. So cellulose is that nice strong polysaccharide, which you can also see some dotted lines right here. Cellulose can actually hydrogen bond with itself in order to form really, really strong threads that help the plant stand up. Plants aren't the only ones with cell walls. These fungal cells, for example, if I were to zoom in on the layer of cell wall on the outside, I'd find this big tangle of molecules right here, which has some other polysaccharides in it, one called glucan and another that you guys have heard before called chitin. This is the one that's super hard, that's around there to help make the fungus stand up on itself. You can even see this fungus has an enzyme embedded in its cell membrane, chitin synthase, which A's means enzyme, synth means to make. So this is the enzyme that's responsible for making all the chitin here. So you can see one organelle providing enzymes to make the other organelle, the cell membrane helping the cell wall get formed. Bacteria also have cell walls on the outside of their cell membrane. Here you can see this little area where they've basically taken the outside of the cell and pretended to peel it apart. So you can see the cell membrane or plasma membrane on the inside, and then the cell wall is right on the outside of that. The nutshell here is that plants, fungi, and bacteria use different macromolecules to create similar cell walls, all of which provide structural support for those cells. So who's large and in charge in the cell? Well, the big boss is the nucleus. So if you look at the entire cell, the nucleus is very centrally located, and here it is sort of blown up right here. And the nucleus has several functions. First off, it contains DNA, and that's the boss code that actually bosses around the cell. But the boss needs somebody to boss around. So this little area inside the nucleus called the nucleolus is the place where the boss's minions are made. And the minions in this case are ribosomes, which you can see floating around the outside of the nucleus, waiting to hear what the master has to say. And when the boss wants to boss around the minions, it sends a message in the form of RNA, which is just a little photocopy of the DNA. And the RNA needs to get out to the minions, and it has a special way to do that through a little structure called a nuclear pore, which, like the pores on your nose, are little holes. I've drawn it in yellow here, and you can see better in the diagram over here on the left some fully drawn three-dimensional nuclear pores that allow the messages to get out of the nucleus and then go to the minions to boss them around. The minions themselves are aptly designed to receive those messages. So, for example, you can see here's the RNA molecule, and the message is going through like this, and it's being read one letter at a time, right down there. And then based on what the message says, the ribosome is using that message to construct a long chain of amino acids right here that's coming out the top. As you guys know, amino acids are the monomers of proteins. So really, the way a ribosome listens to the boss is by reading the code and using it to make a protein. And you can see the growing protein chain coming out of the top of this ribosome right here. So what do we call the region where the minions and the other organelles are floating around? Well, generally speaking, it's referred to as the cytoplasm, and the cytoplasm is defined physically by being inside the cell membrane, but outside of the nuclear envelope, the name of the membrane that surrounds the nucleus. So all of the region in blue is considered cytoplasm. Outside the cell membrane, for example, where the cell wall is, like out here in this space, is called the ECM, or the extracellular matrix. Extra means outside, like extraterrestrials come from another planet outside of Earth. So extracellular means outside the cell, and then it's called a matrix because there are all sorts of macromolecules floating around out there, such as the cellulose or chitin or glucan that makes up the cell wall.